South London in the 1960s was a place of change. Culture was beginning to surge in the forms of fashion, music, and art, and the idea of the city as an iconic epicenter of the modern world was starting to become more well-refined. Everywhere you looked, businesses were booming. Barbers, tailors, bars, clubs, and boutiques found success on the streets of Croydon and Brixton, each of them full of well-dressed people heading into the heart of the city. This was a new world of light, sound, atmosphere, and energy. But deeper into London's underbelly, something darker was growing. The brutal world of British organized crime had been spreading throughout London across the 1950s and had reached something of a peak at the turn of the 60s. The notorious Kray twins were causing havoc with their firm in Bethnal Green, which saw Ronald, Reginald, and their associates running gambling and protection rackets, steeping their careers in murder, arson, and assault as they did so. Theirs was a world of unmatched authority, where huge amounts of money shifted across the city's underworld to the very worst of people London had to offer. Many smaller organized crime groups rose and fell during this time, stamped out by the unattainable force of the Krays, except for one. Towards the end of the 1950s, an organization began to rise to power that could match the reputation of the Kray Firm, and perhaps even rival them: the Richardson Gang. Founded by the cunning and nefarious Charlie and Eddie Richardson, this group of particularly cruel gangsters found its way to success throughout the subsequent 1960s, when the Krays operations were in full swing. Coming to be known as the Torture Gang, their modus operandi was particularly sadistic, as they mutilated, severed, and bludgeoned their way to success. In today's video, we will be delving into the files once more to meet the Richardson Gang up close and personal. Join us as we attempt to dissect the story behind some of London's most brutal gangsters, from their savage beginnings to their eventual downfall. This is the story of London's brutal Torture Gang. The Richardson Gang revolved around two key figures: Charles William Charlie Richardson and his younger brother, Edward G. Eddie Richardson. Charlie was born on the 18th of January 1934, and Eddie came almost exactly 2 years later, on the 21st of January 1936. Their parents, who married 1 year before Charlie's birth, were Elizabeth Mary and Charles Frederick Richardson, who resided in Brentford, a suburban town towards the west of London, in the county of Middlesex. There is no evidence to suggest that the family were involved in crime, organized or otherwise, throughout Eddie and Charlie's childhoods, but they did have ties to South London and moved to Camberwell just before Eddie's birth. In 1940, the Richardson family would welcome one more member, Elaine Richardson, Mary and Charles's first and only daughter. In these early years, while Charlie and Eddie were enjoying their childhoods, one of the Richardson Gang's future members was already experimenting with the world of organized crime. In Billingsgate, located in the southeast corner of London's boundaries, George Cornell, a 12-year-old boy, had recently found work as a fish porter at Billingsgate Fish Market. His work would take him to the nearby Billingsgate docks, where he would meet gangsters Lenny Hamilton and Billy Frost. Hamilton and Frost introduced Cornell to the world of organized credit rackets, and he would soon find himself bringing in a steady illegal income alongside his work at the fish market. It wouldn't be long before Cornell was fully immersed in the world of organized crime, leading him down a path from which he could not, and would not, escape. Around the same time, one of the Richardson Gang's most notorious members had already begun to immerse himself in organized crime. Francis Davison, Frankie Fraser, otherwise known as Mad Frankie, had grown up in Waterloo to an impoverished Roman Catholic family. Having begun committing petty crimes with his sister from the age of 10, Fraser would turn to more serious crimes during the late 1930s. His actions saw him serve time in both Borstal and prison for breaking and entering into a series of businesses based in Waterloo. Eventually, He would be enlisted to fight in World War II during the 1940s, where he deserted from his barracks on multiple occasions. He was subsequently dismissed from the army and began turning to more serious crimes as the war waged in the background. Fraser found it easy to get away with his misdeeds during the war, as authoritative attention was turned to protecting the country from the Germans. Just before he joined up with the Richardsons, Fraser was working as a bodyguard to the infamous London gangster William Charles "Billy" Hill, and served a stint in HM Prison Durham in the northeast of England for his roles in several bank robberies. While inside, he was certified insane and found himself transferred to Broadmoor Hospital in Crowthorne. Reportedly, Fraser was nervous that he would be heavily medicated while incarcerated in Broadmoor, and therefore stayed out of trouble. He would be released in 1955, but could not stay away from crime for long. Across his time in Britain's organized crime scene, he spent upwards of 42 years behind bars, almost half his life. These sentences would be served across 20 of England's prisons, and during most of his stints inside, he was extremely violent. In 1969, while serving time for his role in the Richardson Gang's crimes, he would be instrumental in the notorious Parkhurst prison riot, where he spent 6 weeks in hospital and had his sentence extended. How was the Richardson Gang actually formed, however? Well, in the early 1950s, as Charlie and Eddie Richardson entered their adolescence, their father, Charles, abandoned the family. Life instantly became much harder for the brothers, and money was not easy to come by. As such, they steadily became engaged in the world of organized crime. The records go dark around this time, and it is not particularly clear how the Richardsons formed their gang officially, but by the mid-1950s, they had begun engaging in racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and illegal gambling. This brought them into a world full of shady connections and potential allies, and they slowly began to amass a following of small-time gangsters who wanted in on their illegal yet lucrative lifestyle. In 1963, Frankie Fraser would become an ally of the Richardsons after they helped him avoid an arrest for his part in the Great Train robbery. The Richardsons had bribed a police officer to let Fraser go, and for the remainder of his career, worked closely with the gang. George Cornell would eventually join in 1964, actively defecting from working alongside the Kray twins. Cornell became very close friends with Fraser, and the two would eventually act as enforcers for the gang. So, the Richardson Gang had been formed and was now in full swing. How did they go down in history as one of the most brutal London gangs of all time, however? As the 1960s progressed, the Richardson Gang began to engage in much more serious crimes. Racketeering led to counterfeiting, which in turn led to robberies and burglaries, which soon turned extremely violent. In the early 1960s, the Richardsons took their gang in a new, much darker direction. In order to secure clients, payments, and to tighten their stranglehold on the city in the face of the Kray twins, they began to turn to assault, gun running, narcotics dealing, and torture. The latter gave them a fearsome reputation across the wider London area as some of the most sadistic and brutal gangsters the city had ever seen, and people were well within their rights to fear them. Torture was reserved for individuals or the owners of businesses who, after siding with the Richardsons, became unable to pay up. Often, members of the gang who had begun to exhibit signs of disloyalty or those who were disobeying orders were punished with torture as well. On one notable occasion, a junior member of the gang who was responsible for collecting protection money from the proprietors of local pubs had been pocketing large sums of cash for himself and had been seen spending it at the local dog racing track in Catford. By the orders of Charlie and Eddie Richardson, this man was apprehended, kidnapped, and taken to a warehouse not far from London's Tower Bridge. Here, he was confronted by the gang's enforcers who, upon confirming that he had stolen money from the gang, proceeded to hammer nails into his body, attaching him to the floor of the warehouse before abandoning him. Here he was left for 48 straight hours, in agonizing pain, as other members of the gang, notably Harry Beard, an accomplished getaway driver, would come and add to his suffering. Reportedly, Beard would regularly urinate on those being tortured, while others would inflict additional pain onto those held captive. While Charlie Richardson would vehemently deny all allegations of torture that were carried out by himself and his men, the evidence greatly stacked up against him. Reportedly, the gang's enforcers' favorite torture method was to hold a victim down while their teeth were pulled out from the gums one by one. The gangsters are said to have used pliers to remove their victims' teeth, while on other occasions, bolt cutters were allegedly used to sever the fingers and toes of those who had double-crossed the gang. These actions soon led to the Richardsons becoming known as the torture gang across the city, infamous for their gruesome methods of dealing with their opponents. Interestingly, in 2012, one of Charlie Richardson's best friends, a reformed bank robber by the name of Bobby Cummins, gave an interview to the BBC, claiming that many accusations of torture at the hands of the gang were embellished. Reportedly, while much of the alleged torture was being carried out, Charlie himself wasn't even in the country. He was in South Africa, attempting to bug British Prime Minister Harold Wilson's phone for an overseas intelligence group. Cummins told the BBC that Charlie was simply a small pawn in a big political game, and that he was not the devil they tried to portray him as. By Cummins' accounts, this supposedly feared gangster was a loving family man who carried an old-fashioned respect for those around him. Of course, there is no smoke without fire, and the evidence suggests that the Richardson gang were involved in the brutal torture of their opponents, even if Charlie himself didn't carry out the brutality. While it should be considered that claims of torture were blown out of proportion to create a good story for the media, several accounts describe how Charlie Richardson administered torture locations himself, in secret locations across the city known as courts. Some accounts even note that he played a theatrical part in the gore and bloodshed, sometimes dressing in judges' robes before Mad Frankie Fraser stepped in to deliver the punishment. Some accounts state how the gang would even carry out mock proceedings in their courts, often reserved for formerly loyal gangsters who had double-crossed the gang. These proceedings were almost always for show, and the leaders of the gang always intended for the outcome to be severe torture, likely to keep other potential offenders in line. These bizarre theatrical performances were usually finished with Fraser whipping, electrocuting, or even burning the accused. His brutal torture methods would, however, catch up to him later on in his career. However much the Richardsons were involved in torture and extreme violence, there's no denying one thing. They were able to build a mighty criminal empire from nothing, one that would even rival the Krays. Towards the beginning of the 1960s, the Richardson gang attempted to maintain a certain degree of peace with the Kray twins and their infamous firm. George Cornell would be key to this arrangement and would act as a mediator at meetings between the two sides. Unfortunately, however, tensions rose towards the mid to late 1960s, and relations between the two groups began to break up. Now, as you can imagine, the Kray twins, whom we have previously covered on this channel, were not the kind of men you wanted to make enemies of. They effectively ruled the city and many of its illegal rackets, and to start a feud with the Krays would be to seriously jeopardize not only any illegal enterprises Charlie and Eddie had been running, but the lives of many of their men. Nonetheless, in December of 1965, large groups of men working for both the Kray Firm and Richardson Gang headed down to the Astor Club, a nightclub in Mayfair, for a Christmas party. Attending were the Kray twins themselves and several of Richardson's key enforcers. At some point during the party, Cornell is known to have started drunkenly lashing insults out at Ronnie Kray, who didn't take kindly to his attitude, and a vicious fistfight broke out. Neither man was seriously harmed, but the party came to an almost immediate standstill. For the next few months, no major interactions between the Krays and Richardsons ensued, but this would all change as winter turned to spring. On the 8th of March, 1966, Richard Hart, an associate of the Kray Firm, was shot dead following a bar fight with several members of the Richardson Gang at a club in Rushy Green, Catford. This was Richardson turf. Eddie Richardson and Frank Fraser had been asked to protect the club for a fee, and both were present the night Hart had been killed. Reportedly, before the fight ensued, the atmosphere was good. Men from both sides had been drinking and chatting. and Hart had been in attendance with his friend and Kray Firm ally, Peter Hennessy. At some point around 1 in the morning, Eddie Richardson had told Hennessy and Hart to finish their drinks and leave, but they weren't ready to make a move. Hennessy started to verbally assault Richardson, who in turn began threatening the Kray associate. The two started to brawl and fists soon turned to gunshots as Hart's life came to an end. This heavily soured relations between the two groups of gangsters, and for years following the shooting, there was always a bad atmosphere between the gangs of South London. While several gang members had been arrested that night when the police were inevitably called, much of the blame had been placed on Fraser. He was particularly brutal and unpredictable, even by the standards of organized crime. In fact, prior to the incident at the club, he had been declared insane by authorities, but had been allowed to walk the streets a free man. It is thought that he obtained the moniker Mad Frankie from this very incident, although much of his criminal career had been fraught with events just as alarming. Supposedly, after Hart had been shot, Fraser was seen repeatedly kicking him in the head. The following day, on the 9th of March, 1966, the feud continued. This time, the Krays retaliated. Jimmy Andrews, one of the members of the Richardson Gang who had been injured in the bar fight, had sought treatment at the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. As he was receiving treatment, George Cornell, his longtime friend, had come to visit him. This would be the last time Cornell would be seen alive. That evening, Cornell and his friend Albie Woods headed to the Blind Beggar pub on Whitechapel Road for an evening of drinking. They ordered their pints and settled down next to the bar. That evening, at 8:30, none other than Ronnie Kray walked in, along with his associate, Ian Barry. Upon seeing Kray, Cornell is believed to have smiled and said, "Well, just look who's here." Barry escalated the confrontation by firing 2 warning shots into the ceiling, causing the bar staff and other patrons to flee. Kray, on the other hand, slowly rose his 9mm Luger pistol, pointed it at Cornell's head, and pulled the trigger. Kray had missed Cornell's brain, planting the bullet just above his right eye. He slumped down, barely alive, against one of the pub's pillar supports and was rushed to hospital. He didn't make it and passed away at around 3:30 in the morning the following day. Although it was known far and wide that Ronnie Kray had committed murder in broad daylight in front of a room of witnesses, he was not charged yet. In fact, at this time, nobody dared to testify against him, and although he was arrested, he was released from custody later that day. A few years later, in March of 1969, both Krays would find themselves on trial. Ronnie stood accused of Cornell's murder, while Reggie was charged with having killed Jack McVitie, a former member of the firm. They were both found unanimously guilty by a jury and received life imprisonment. Nothing would be the same for the Richardson Gang after that fateful encounter at the Rushy Green Club. By July of 1966, when the immediate fear surrounding the shooting had calmed down, the events of the night were reported to the police. This event would ultimately help to bring the crimes of the Richardsons to a close, in a dramatic court case known colloquially as the torture trial. It wasn't just the shooting of Hart that brought them down either. One by one, members of the Richardson Gang had been arrested and detained for their crimes over the course of the prior few months, and very few remained active on the streets. Their empire, once an affluent source of income from their multitude of violent crimes, was beginning to crumble. The incident at the club came paired with the reporting of a crime by an anonymous victim that same month who had been brutally assaulted by the Richardsons. The victim was an associate of the gang who had been found guilty of disloyalty by a kangaroo court of gang members who unanimously intended on assaulting him either way. He was stripped of his clothing and beaten within an inch of his life. Reportedly, he was left alone to mop up his own blood with his torn clothing. What's more is that the Richardsons' own gang members were beginning to turn on them, seeing no other option after they had been arrested and tried in a court of law. One such individual was Johnny Bradbury, a formerly faithful Richardson Gang member who had been sentenced to death by hanging for his role in the murder of a business associate. Bradbury voluntarily offered up his services as an informant in exchange for an official pardon. He received immunity and thereby escaped the noose in an arrangement by CYD Inspector Gerald MacArthur. This was not a common occurrence, and MacArthur had this arranged personally so he could attempt to bring the Richardsons to justice once and for all. This led MacArthur to spearhead a campaign to surmount as much evidence as possible against the remaining members of the Richardson Gang, primarily Eddie, Charlie, and Mad Frankie Fraser. Anybody who could provide evidence against these wanted men, even if they had committed crimes alongside the Richardsons themselves, would be granted immunity from prosecution if they agreed to turn in any information. The Home Office began to arrange new identities and passports for those who agreed to turn evidence in, and, to their delight, they had several willing witnesses. Before long, Eddie Richardson had been apprehended by police under the charge of affray, the act of fighting one or more people in a public place that inflicts terror on ordinary members of society. After a short trial, he had been found guilty and was sentenced to serve 5 years in prison. That was one Richardson brother down, but the police intended to stack a series of additional charges against him. What had become of Charlie at this stage, however? On the 30th of July 1966, Charlie Richardson was arrested following an accusation of grievous bodily harm. Along with him, the police had carried out several raids on known Richardson Gang hideouts and haunts across the southern stretches of the city, and they had been arrested too. They were held in custody for the remainder of the year, and the torture trial official began at London's Old Bailey Court towards the beginning of April 1967. Here, Charlie was charged not only with grievous bodily harm, but fraud, extortion, and assault, which culminated in a massive 25-year prison sentence. Eddie, on the other hand, faced the same charges, but due to Charlie's prominent involvement in Richardson Gang activities, he received an additional 10 years in prison, bringing his sentence to a total of 15 years. What happened to Mad Frankie in all of this, though? Well, he would be charged with the murder of Hart following the fateful events of that night in the club. A few months after the crime had been committed, the charges would eventually be dropped, and Fraser was a free man once again, but he did receive 5 years for affray. In the torture trial, he was found guilty of pulling the teeth from one of the Richardsons' victims using a pair of pliers, and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. So, it looked like the end was nearing for the Richardson Gang. Sentenced to the best part of a life term, with almost all of their means of income halted, the next few decades were not easy, to say the least. Charlie Richardson, in particular, proved to be a very difficult prisoner to keep tabs on. In 1980, when he was nearing the end of his sentence, he fled custody and wasn't tracked down for almost a year. This followed his numerous attempts to obtain an early release, but each time, he was denied parole. He had, at the time, been transferred to an open prison, where escape was made much easier, but officers had placed their trust in him to remain where he was. Colloquially termed going on the trot, Richardson would spend most of 1980 evading the law where he could. At one point, he even made a public appearance dressed as Father Christmas and handed out Christmas presents to London's children to publicize his attempts at gaining a release. He would frequently be seen with his friends and family drinking in South London pubs, and even managed to escape the country, fleeing to Paris, where he gave a series of media interviews about his crimes. Towards the end of 1980, Richardson was brought back into the arms of the law when police apprehended him in Earl's Court on suspicion of carrying drugs. At the time, the police didn't even realize it was him. His probation officer contacted the police once other gang members became aware of his arrest. Despite his previous escape attempts, the police began to trust him once again, and he was allowed day release in 1983 to partake in voluntary work, helping disabled people in Kensington. He completed his sentence officially in 1984 and was released back into the community. At this point, Eddie had also been released, but he wasn't destined for freedom for long. In 1990, he was sentenced to a massive 35 years imprisonment after being caught taking part in a cocaine and cannabis heist, almost getting away with 70 million pounds. He ended up serving 12 years of this sentence in total. Following Eddie's second incarceration, he and Charlie grew distant, and eventually, the atmosphere soured for good. Eddie had accused Charlie of fraudulent business dealings while Eddie was locked up. It's unknown whether or not he actually was doing so, however. Eddie was released from prison in 2001 and is still alive. During his time locked up, he learned to paint and now sells his artwork to critical acclaim. Charlie, on the other hand, passed away in 2012 at the age of 78. Having been a heavy smoker for almost all of his life, he contracted a severe case of peritonitis following years of struggling with emphysema. Perhaps the most unusual outcome for a member of the Richardson Gang was that of Mad Frankie Fraser. He was released from prison following the torture trial in 1985 and, by all accounts, stayed away from the world of crime. He became a minor British celebrity, appearing on a series of panel quiz shows and satirical comedies. He proceeded to act in BBC radio dramas and even hosted his own live tour, An Evening with Mad Frankie Fraser, in 1999. Following this, he personally hosted a tour of famous gang locations across London, including the site at the Blind Beggar pub, where Ronnie Kray shot and killed George Cornell. In 1991, however, his past began to catch up with him. He was shot at very close range in the face, in a murder attempt that left him with part of his mouth permanently disfigured. As he entered his late 80s, he developed Alzheimer's disease and fell critically ill in 2014. Following an injury sustained from leg surgery, he was placed into an induced coma. His family turned off his life support machine in the November of that year. As far as British gangsters go, there are very few who have been able to contend with the bloody, gruesome reputation of the Richardson Gang. Well and truly, giving the legendary Kray twins a run for their money, they developed a brutal stranglehold on London's organized crime scene across the late 50s and 60s, and their names have gone down in history as such. While their methods of torture were brutal and unnecessary, Mad Frankie Fraser seemed to turn his life around in his later years, while Eddie Richardson continues to make an honest living for himself today with his paintings. It's a massive contrast from the teeth-pulling, finger-severing, bone-breaking habits he used to partake in, but surely it's a change for the better.